We're very happy to have Craig Nelson with us this evening. It's his first time at Politics and Prose, but he comes with lots of book industry experience behind him, both as an author of popular histories and also for a time as a publishing executive with Harper and Row, Hyperion, and Random House. A couple of Craig's previous books have reflected an interest in space and aeronautics. His best-selling Rocket Men chronicled the race to the moon, and The First Heroes looked back at the Doolittle raid on Japan during World War II. But he's also written a biography of Thomas Paine and documented a trail of adventurous foreign travel in a book titled Let's Get Lost. His new work, The Age of Radiance, is a sweeping account of the world's involvement with atomic power. He takes us from the discovery of X-rays in 1895 to the Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster in 2011. But as one reviewer said, this is not just a march of science tale. Craig tells the story with the dramatic flair it deserves, detailing, as the Los Angeles Times said, all the missteps and accidental discoveries, the manipulations and malfeasance, the outsized personalities and egos of this history. He profiles the fascinating figures who've defined the nuclear era, among them, of course, Marie and Pierre Curie, Albert Einstein, and J. Robert Oppenheimer. He also addresses how nuclear developments have influenced politics, from Roosevelt and Truman to the present, and how radioactivity has come to touch our lives in many ways, not all bad. The whole history of the atomic age, as Craig describes it, comes across as a very mixed bag, actually, of positives and negatives, of threatening forces and constructive advances. So there's definitely a lot to discuss this evening. Please join me in welcoming Craig Nelson.
Well, before I begin, I want to thank one of the finest bookstores in America for having me as a guest. And I want to remind all of you, do not sit at home and order all your damn books online. Get out of the house and come to a great bookstore like this one, because, you know, if you come here, maybe you'll meet someone. Maybe you'll have an affair. Maybe you'll fall in love. But if you stay at home and order your books online, none of that will happen. So come on, get out of the house, go to a store, hang around. You never know. But before I continue, I need to ask all of you to please be patient with me. I've been working nonstop for 2 weeks. I've averaged about 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night. And I'm old, and this is getting hard, and so I'm in sort of a hypnagogic state, and that's that border between consciousness and unconsciousness. And normally, when I'm in this state, I'm on a big, nice couch in front of the TV, but instead, here I am in front of you. So I just need you to be a little patient, because it may be a little erratic how we get there, but I think we're going to get to the meat of the matter eventually. So last week on the radio, a woman asked me, "Kind sir, please tell me, how do I avoid this deadly radiation of which you speak?" And I said, "Well, ma'am, it's in your adobe and your granite and your kitty litter. It's in your microwave oven and your smoke detector. It's raining down at you from cosmic rays in the skies and rising up at you from uranium decaying in the bedrock. It's in your cats and your dogs. It's in your pets and your family. It's in your friends, and it's in you. And right now, that warm feeling all of you have, actually, you're all irradiating each other as we speak. You're so radioactive, you're irradiating each other. And in fact, one of the things I wasn't able to get to in doing the research for this book was, does the combination of our own radiation, our pheromones, and our sparkling personality, does that produce human chemistry? So if any of you could look into that, that would be great. Also, on that radio show, another woman asked, did I go to the history school? How did I get this job? Did I go to the history school? And I said, no, miss, I did not go to the little history school. When I went to school, we had to study theories of crazy French people. I was semioticioning this and deconstructing that. It was a tough life. But one thing that has stuck with me to this day was that there are two kinds of meaning in the world. denotation and connotation. Can you hear me? Am I speaking into this? Okay, great. So denotation and connotation. Now, denotation is the meaning you get when you look up something in the dictionary or the encyclopedia. It's like the plain facts of the case. But connotation is everything else. It's the illusion and the implication and the poetry. And it's what something means to each one of us. So if you had asked me 5 long dog years ago when I started writing on this book, what does radiation mean to me? Oh, so does American Horror Story pay you royalties for this font? Or how does that work? You know, that TV show uses your font. I'm going to look into that for you when I get home. Okay, so connotation. If someone 5 years ago said to me, what does radiation connote to you? I would say infection, cancer, danger, sinister, creepy, icky, this kind of thing. But now I found out that the denotation of radiation is not like that at all. It's little chubby fat atoms. It's these little atoms, and they're so fat they break the law of gravity that forms the material world and spit out little pieces of themselves. They spit out 2 little subatomic particles and a gamma ray, which is like an X-ray, which is made up of photons, which I was happy to learn because photons are my favorite elementary particle. So anyway, little chubby atoms, sinister cancer. As you can see already, we're having an epic battle between denotation and connotation, and we just got started. So, and one of the things that really struck me about these little fat atoms was that when you look at the early explorers of radioactivity, they're just in awe of what's going on. So Marie Curie, she would come to her lab at dawn before the sun came up, and she would leave all of her radium out on the walls, and she would see it glowing like aquatic fireflies when she came in. And then someone noticed that when she put the radium away, the walls were still glowing. Then, like when Enrico Fermi made plutonium, people said you would hold this silvery substance in your hands and it would be warm like a puppy. But then someone else said that, well, you know, at Los Alamos, the medical solution for holding the puppy too long was called high amputation. So you're seeing this sort of theme for tonight is a little bit adorable and a little bit horror movie. And that's our theme for this evening. No, but before I forget, before we go on, there's one other thing about this denotation and connotation, and that is, you know, when we were kids, we had to learn the denotation of history. We had to learn the dates of births and deaths of great men, epochs, battles, kings and queens of England and France, all this stuff. But when I learned history as a practice, I learned it from the guy who invented it, who was a Greek named Herodotus. And he said history isn't about any of that. It's about one thing and one thing only, and that is, have I got a story for you? Once upon a time, there was a little girl named Manya, who was the youngest of 5 of a family that had once been prosperous, but had fallen on hard times. When Manya was about 17, her eldest sister Branya said, let's make a deal. You go to work and support me for 2 years while I go to school, and then I'll turn around and do the same thing for you. And this was an especially wild idea at that time because it was illegal for women over the age of 12 to get an education. And Branya and Manya were getting around this by attending something called the Floating University, which floated so that the authorities couldn't figure out who was running it and throw him or her in a labor camp. Now, the Floating University did an incredible job. Branya got into medical school at the University of Paris, the Sorbonne, and off she goes, and Manya goes off to be a nanny. And the first couple of people she works for, she hates their guts. And we've got fantastic things in her letters viciously attacking these people. But then she meets a family called the Zurawskis. And the Zurawskis run a sugar beet plantation about 50 kilometers outside of Warsaw. And she loves them, and they love her, and the children love her. And then the oldest son, Casimir, comes home from school. And Casimir and Manya fall head over heels in love. And for a year they date, and finally he says, I'm going to tell my parents we're getting married. And the parents say, no, you are not getting married. We want you to marry someone of your station. We don't want you to marry this little penniless nobody, Manya. And he tells her, please wait for me, please wait. I'll talk him into it. And 6 months go by, and they find out the two of them are secretly seeing each other, and they fire her. And off she goes back to Warsaw. Now she's 19. She's heartbroken. She's living with her father. And the letter shows up from Branya. I've graduated from school. I've engaged to be married, and now it's your turn. Come to Paris. But she can't go because she's so in love with Casimir. And she's waiting and waiting and waiting, and her heart is broken. And finally a letter appears from Casimir. Forget it. It's never going to happen. We're never getting married. And off she goes to Paris. Decades later, Casimir would become a famous mathematician in Warsaw, and he would be seen frequently in the main square of Warsaw, staring up at the enormous statue of the national hero of Poland, Marie Curie, which is who Manya grew up to be. And I love this story so much because it's sort of like, don't follow your heart, Manya, become Marie Curie. Anyway, and I also love this story because when I first started working on this book, I thought, well, Marie Curie, she's this cold-hearted, brainiac scientist woman who's sort of heartless and all head and no heart. And then like the first 2,000 pages I read about her, they just reinforced all of that. And I spent the first 10 years living in New York. I lived in an Eastern European neighborhood. And I finished reading all this, and excuse me for saying it, but I thought, this doesn't sound like any Polish woman I ever met. So then I started finding out that besides Pierre, Marie had quite a love life besides this guy that she almost married and didn't. And besides Pierre, after Pierre died, Marie had this spectacular affair with one of Pierre's students. But before I go, excuse me. See, this is why I asked for your forbearance. Let me back up a little bit. We've all heard the name Marie and Pierre Curie. What did they do? Well, they basically refined the discovery of radiation and figured out how it could have medical uses and figured out how to extract two of its elements and created a medical form of therapy. And they did all this working out of a hut used to dissect cadavers by the Community College of Paris. So, and I don't want to give short shift to Pierre. I love Pierre because he discovered one of my favorite forms of electricity, which is piezoelectricity, which is where you squeeze crystals in a certain way and it produces sparks. And I've always wanted to learn how to do that, and someday I will. But anyway, back to the affair. So after Pierre dies, 6 years later, Marie starts having this torrid affair with one of his students, a guy by the name of Paul Langevin. And Paul is so famous that in my big picture of the most famous physicists of all time in 1927, he's sitting next to Einstein, okay? So he and Marie have this fantastic relationship. They're famous physicists. They're working together. They rent a house. They call it Our House, and that's where they're having an affair. The letters are going back and forth, hot and heavy, but Paul's married. And Paul's wife is okay with him having a mistress, but she's not okay with the mistress being the most famous woman in France. And Paul's wife has a brother who runs a newspaper, and he starts slamming Marie. Oh, this interloper, she's breaking down the family. How can she do this? She's a foreigner. Maybe she's Jewish. What's going on here? All this kind of stuff. To such an extent that when Marie gets ready to go get her second Nobel Prize, the committee in Stockholm says, maybe you could come next year. Maybe you don't need to come this year. And she asks Einstein for his advice, and she goes, screw them, go get the prize. But anyway, so the affair ends, and Paul, of course, goes back to his wife, as we knew he would. But the incredible thing that happened is that Marie, though heartbroken, takes his advice, and he hires one of Paul's students, Fred. And Fred's a real go-getter. And he comes into the lab, and he's just tearing it up. And after a year, he goes, Marie, I've got to tell you something. I'm in love with your daughter, Irene, and we want to get married. And what does Marie do? Exactly what Casimir's parents did. No way, forget it. She makes Fred sign one of the first prenups in history that if anything happens to their marriage, all the radium sticks with the Curies. But Marie was wrong. In fact, Fred and Irene are more important to us today than Marie and Pierre, because Fred and Irene discovered artificial radiation, which is a part of nuclear medicine, which is as important to modern medicine today as the microscope. And because of this long story I've told you, Marie Curie was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, and the second woman to win a Nobel Prize was her own daughter, Irene. So after Fred and Irene discovered artificial radiation, this created a huge craze, and everybody wanted to do it. And they're irradiating everything. And one of the people irradiating lots of stuff is a villainous chemist named Otto Hahn in Berlin. And he's a villainous chemist because he will do a dreadful, dreadful thing. He will help to ensure that none of you have ever heard the name Lise Meitner. Lise Meitner discovered fission, and she was driven out of history by the Nazis for being Jewish, and she was driven out of history again by the post-war Germans for being a woman, so I'd like to tell you her story, if I may. Lise was the second woman in the 500-year history of the University of Vienna to get an advanced degree. She was the first woman professor in the history of Germany. She ran the physics department of the world's leading research institution for 12 years. And then at the age of 60, she was driven out of Germany by the Nazis, and she ended up in Sweden working for somebody who hated her. And her life was totally in tatters. Everything was dead for her. Nothing was going to happen for her, and she was completely miserable. And her nephew, Otto Robert, showed up for Christmas. And together they had a Scandinavian delicacy called lutefisk. Now, I don't know if you are familiar with lutefisk. It's basically, it's the beef jerky that you get at a 7-Eleven, but it's made from fish, and it's the consistency of Jell-O, and it's the worst thing I've ever put in my mouth. And I have put fried tarantula legs in my mouth, so you can imagine what this. Anyway, so after a lovely dinner of lutefisk, they're walking in the snow, and Lisa just can't get her mind out of what villainous chemist Otto Hahn has come up with back in Berlin, because every time he fires neutrons at uranium, he gets barium. Okay, so if you look at the periodic table and you look up at all the radioactive things we have now, anytime you irradiate something, it moves a little bit up or down on the table because it creates an isotope or a slight variation. But barium is way down the table from uranium, and no one can figure out why this is happening. They assume something is wrong with the instruments, something is wrong with the chemistry. They don't know what's wrong. So Lisa Meitner gets out a piece of paper and a pencil and sits down on a snow-covered log in Sweden, and she thinks about Niels Bohr's idea that the nucleus of an atom could be like a water droplet, and you could actually like push it hard enough and it would split in half like on a piece of wax paper. And then she looks at the size of uranium and the size of barium, and she calculates what would happen if you cut uranium in half and you released some of it as energy and you ended up with what's left. And what she got was E equals MC2 and barium. And when her nephew went back to Denmark, his next door neighbor was a guy who worked in biology, and the nephew said, "What do you call it when bacteria splits in half?" And the neighbor said, "Fission." She discovered fission. So now, if you thought artificial radiation was fun, you should see what these scientists did when they heard about fission. They just went crazy. And almost everyone wondered, well, but this could produce something of incredible power. It could produce either energy or it could produce a bomb. And what if Hitler had that bomb? So what happens from now until 1945, or 1938, from 1938 to 1945, what is going to happen is that all of the American physicists will think this idea is the craziest thing they've ever heard in their life. They'll think everyone working on this is nuts. But all of the refugees coming from Europe fleeing Hitler will think, what if Hitler had the bomb? And that will be the whole force of the Manhattan Project. Now, one of the things that I really like in sort of reading, that going through what a generally educated person knows about this history, is the fact that basically we're taught that Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer wrote a couple of equations on a blackboard, and then bam, we had bombs. And what happened in between those two things happening was the most dangerous experiments in the history of science. The third most dangerous experiment in the history of science happened in the middle of Chicago, because the guy who was going to create the first nuclear reactor had his facility strike. The construction crew struck, and so he had to find another place to put it. So they found the University of Chicago had stopped playing football, and their football stadium was abandoned, and inside the abandoned football stadium was an abandoned squash court. And this is where the first nuclear reactor was built, in the middle of the city of Chicago, which it seems to me could have turned out badly. But instead, the experiment was done so well that it came off perfectly. And the really ironic, funny twist to this story is that the Soviet spies reporting back to Moscow on this event, there was a screw-up in the translation. So for almost 40 years, the NKVD thought that the first nuclear reactor was born not in a squash court, but in a pumpkin patch. So I don't know if you remember, but the bomb produced for Hiroshima looked like almost a child's drawing of a bomb. It's, you know, a thing like this with tails. And the one produced for Nagasaki is this giant orb covered in wires. And the reason for that is that the one produced for Hiroshima was literally the simplest bomb ever made. It's essentially a gun inside of a bomb where a plug of uranium is shot into a bowl of uranium. And it was so simple that they didn't even test it before they dropped it on Japan. And it was so simple that they burned all of the designs in a fire after Los Alamos was disbanded, so that people couldn't see how easy it was to make this bomb. But the one thing that was not simple was the second most dangerous experiment in the history of American science, where They needed to find out how much of this dish and how much of this plug they needed to make the bomb. So who was doing this? Otto Robert, the nephew who helped discover fission. He, in the middle of nowhere in Los Alamos, he created a guillotine, and he created a set of washers and resizable plugs and would shoot the plugs through the washers. And a physicist named Dick Feynman called it tickling the dragon's tail, because they were trying to go as close to an atomic explosion as possible without actually blowing themselves up. And so that's how the Hiroshima bomb was made. The Nagasaki bomb was a funny story because it was made with plutonium, and the original design was based on getting very pure plutonium, which they did not get from Hanford and Washington and Oak Ridge. So they had to come up with a solution. And one guy named Seth Niedermeyer had the idea that you could make pies of explosions and control the timing so that you could create a perfect explosion. And if you did that perfectly, you could condense a piece of plutonium the size of a orange to one the size of a marble, and that would create the bomb. And everyone thought he was crazy, except for one of my favorite Hungarians in the history of nuclear science, a guy named Johnny von Neumann. Now, Johnny was so famous for his clothes that when he went for his PhD orals, the first question the professors asked was, "Pray, who is the candidate's tailor?" And when he went out mule riding with all the guys from Los Alamos at Grand Canyon, he wore a three-piece pinstripe suit, so he wasn't even as natty. He was even more natty than me. But also, he invented the modern personal computer. He invented the idea that you could use programming, binary programming, for both the programs and the data in a personal computer. And because the most popular computer at that time was called ENIAC, he called his Maniac. His wife said he was such a good mathematician he could count anything except calories. And there's a famous corner in Princeton called the von Neumann Corner, because his favorite thing to do was to read a book while driving. And he crashed his car so often into this one corner of Princeton that he got the corner name for him. So when you see the picture of Trinity, the bomb, and it's this thing covered in wires, all of those wires are to ignite a little tiny part of these explosive lenses to compress and work that. And if you remember the movie Close Encounters, that was essentially what the first atomic bomb looked like on the faces of the people who watched it. These people covered in light and awe, they just can't believe what they're seeing. And all of them have to write about it for the Army and for the Pentagon, and none of them can really do it. So you have to read these spectacular reports. And that really is sort of the sad thing about the end of the nuclear age. We don't get to watch nuclear explosions anymore, as they are quite spectacular and quite beautiful. So one of the fascinating history things that I found out about all of this is that we were all learned that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were good because they ended World War II. That, it was a war that killed 55 million people. If we hadn't used those bombs, we would have sent in a force of 1.5 million people to invade. That would have been gruesome. So good that we did that. But now it's turned out that none of the heads of the military thought we should use atomic weapons on Japan. Eisenhower didn't think so. Marshall didn't think so. The head of the Navy and the head of the Air Force didn't think so. And that, in fact, losing Hiroshima and Nagasaki after losing 60 other cities was not the key to them surrendering. The actual reason they surrendered was when Russia entered the war. And now I was able to find 3 instances of people high up in the chain of command saying the real reason we did that was to scare Stalin. That Stalin was gobbling up Eastern Europe, so we dropped these bombs to show off these weapons that were expensive and also to scare him a little bit. So instead of the end of the World War II, you can sort of think of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as actually the beginning of the Cold War. And the Cold War is my second favorite Hungarian in nuclear science, is Edward Teller. And Edward Teller goes out with his mentor, Enrico Fermi, in 1941, and Fermi created the first atomic reactor. And Fermi says, I don't know why they're making these fission bombs, because these fission bombs are going to be so hot, they're going to combine hydrogen atoms. And if you did that, you can make fusion bombs just like the sun. It would be 3 times as powerful and much less expensive. And this makes Teller go crazy. For the rest of his life, all he wants to do is make a hydrogen or fusion or super bomb. And he becomes so wild that he starts making lists of his favorite bombs. And my favorite of Teller's favorite bombs design is called the backyard bomb, because it's a bomb that's so big and will kill so many people. You don't have to take it and drop it on anybody. You can set it off in your own backyard. So the most dangerous experiment in the history of American science is a Teller experiment, which is called Bikini. And at Bikini, which is where our swimwear comes from, they set off the first big hydrogen test bomb, and they thought it was going to be a 4-megaton bomb, and it was a 15-megaton bomb. And they thought the diameter was going to be like a half a mile. It was a 4-mile diameter fireball. And one of the onlookers had seen many atomic bombs, and he said, "We couldn't believe it. It made atomic bombs look like nothing. It was like this giant brain, like a madman roiling in the sky. And suddenly, all this white snow fell on us, and we realized we were getting irradiated. But no one could even think about that. We just couldn't take our eyes off it." And the amazing thing about that test was that the fallout was so tremendous that it fell on a Japanese fishing boat miles and miles away. And one of the crewmen died before anyone could figure out what was going on. And the tuna was sold into the Japanese fish market before people knew going on. And 6 months later, the movie Godzilla came out. And the reason for this strange coincidence is that when we watched Godzilla, we thought it was a riot because the special effects were so bad and it was comical. But when the Japanese watched it, they thought that they had been the victims of American atomic attacks 3 times in a row. And so Godzilla for them was both the horrible monster attacking them like America was attacking them, but it was also the horrible contaminated by atomic nuclear things Japanese themselves, that their children were going to be like atomic lizards. So a lot of them burst into tears and they couldn't stand watching it and they had to run out of the theater. So for any of you who have children and grandchildren who don't understand the Cold War, one thing to help them understand it is to sit down with them and watch the movie Dr. Strangelove. And instead of looking at it as a comedy, tell them it's a historical documentary, because so much of it is either accurate or does in fact come true. The first part of it is that when you hear Strangelove ranting and raging about how, so what, we lose 20 million people, that's not so bad. Besides, and so what, there's nuclear Armageddon. Old people, they can eat radioactive stuff without getting cancer because they're too old to get the cancer from eating radioactive stuff. And you know what we'll do? We'll do 2 women for every man in deep mine shafts and we'll repopulate the world. So he literally is ranting and raving with all this kind of crazy stuff. The most famous nuclear theoretician of the time sued Kubrick for royalties because so much of that was taken directly from his book. All right. That's number one. Number two, in that movie, you're always seeing the president on the phone with the head of the Soviet Union on the hotline. There was no hotline in America then. It was only come out about 6 months later because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the most astonishing part is that the doomsday machine that ends the world and ends the movie comes true. What happens is that from Eisenhower to Carter, the basic nuclear strategy of the United States is we're going to drop every nuclear weapon we have on the enemy, on Russia and China, and obliterate everybody. And that's essentially the nuclear. And it goes by different names. It's called Sunday Punch, Massive Retaliation. It has like the trappings of being actual theory. But it's basically we're going to drop everything we have. And in the Carter administration, someone comes up with a new idea called decapitation. And in this strategy, they're only going to kill the heads of the Soviet Union. They're going to find out where the Politburo and the Kremlin people are at all times and drop atomic bombs just on them. And they write a big article about this in Foreign Policy magazine, which the heads of the Kremlin and the Politburo all read. And so they get a little upset. So they come up with the idea that if the heads of the government are killed and there are missiles falling on the Soviet Union, then automatically missiles are going to be fired back at the United States. The doomsday machine comes to life. So after you finish Dr. Strangelove, you can have your children and grandchildren watch another movie, The China Syndrome. Because if Americans learned about nuclear science from seeing pictures of the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we ended up learning about nuclear power from the fact that the China Syndrome was in movies theaters at the same time as 3 Mile Island had its meltdown. And even though 3 Mile Island actually didn't damage anybody, in China Syndrome, Jane Fonda actually says, it's going to cause devastation the size of Pennsylvania. There's so many coincidences, it's unbelievable. And those 2 things happening at the same time led to the biggest demonstration in American history, 1 million people in Central Park. the other news about Chernobyl is the fact that we now found out that you can't really say that this was a civil utility problem like the other two. Because in fact, Chernobyl was used both for producing plutonium for atomic weapons and to give electricity to the citizens of Kiev. So it was in fact more of a military accident than anything else. And now, in Russian history, Chernobyl is considered to be the end of the Soviet Union. That when that happened, the vast majority of citizens realized that they did not have the best system of government in the world, that people really were as inept as everyone else had been saying. So in this history coincides with Hiroshima and Nagasaki being the beginning of the Cold War and Chernobyl being the end of it. Now, in case you haven't seen enough irony of this history, I'd like to point out that in Japanese, the word Fukushima means fortunate island. And the amazing thing about that story is that that reactor would have survived both the earthquake and the tsunami if they hadn't put the backup batteries in the basement. That was the only thing that they did wrong. And one of the most incredible moments to me in that history was when the head of the power company says, "We can't do any more. We have to abandon the site." They were just going to leave and let it fall apart and see what happens. But in fact, you can actually take tourist visits to Fukushima and Chernobyl today. But I don't really recommend eating the local food. And when it says keep off the grass, you should probably follow that sign. And the other amazing sort of research find that I found is the fact that during the Cold War testing of the Nevada test sites, they dropped so many bombs that they contaminated all of the continental United States. And now 11,000 Americans die every year from that leftovers of those tests. So all the time that we were worried about the Soviet Union bombing us, it was Washington bombing us that we had to worry about. And the same thing is true there. But you know, I don't want to leave you with this sad story of the continent and all these sad things in Chernobyl. And remember when we first got together talking about Marie Curie's boyfriends? Didn't we have some fun? And you know, I grew up next door to the state with Los Alamos. And for those of you who don't know, Los Alamos refers to a tree, the cottonwood. And cottonwoods are very popular in the desert because they grow in low water conditions and they're very good for timber. And we have a church in the place where I grew up, also called the Alamo, you may have heard of. And on the radio last week, a woman said, "What was your first childhood memory?" And I said, "Well, when I was very little, I had these very strange dreams that I was helping the martyrs of the Alamo escape being murdered. And these dreams had a very action-adventure Schwarzenegger side to them, but they also had this strange sort of spiritual, religious thing." And I was like 4 or 5. It was very weird. And I couldn't figure out why I was having these creepy dreams. And then I went back to visit the Alamo, and I went around in the back where they have the tombstone to everyone who died. And on that tombstone is a sculpture of this beautiful man flying to heaven, carrying the memory and the honor of the dead. And I realized that when I give you a book you can read on a plane, but in it is the real story of Marie Curie or the story of Lisa Meitner, who we've all forgotten. You know, I may not be an angel, ladies and gentlemen, but in many other ways that little boy's dream has come true. And for your time and attention, I thank you kindly. We have microphones if anyone has a question.
I know you're talking about the history, and that's great. I wondered if you have any views on the risk of Washington, D.C. or Manhattan being a target of a nuclear terrorist attack.
I do. The issue he asks is, could we have a dirty bomb attack, right?
Or worse.
Right, okay. So in my opinion, the worst attacks on American soil were done with box cutters. So to then say next is nuclear physics doesn't really strike me. However, there are two things that I think are worrisome, and that is the fact that we have all of this nuclear waste stored in swimming pools next to nuclear facilities at 12 different locations in the United States. And we have this massive transportation network of trucks and trains going on between where we have weapons labs, where the weapons are stored for the military, where the atomic waste is, where the atomic power plants need their stuff. Those are the two things that are frightening to me, not a dirty bomb.
And another topic, it seems like nuclear power plants, the risk of humans doing something wrong and there being an accident, maybe it's something we have to live with.
Well, that's
if
my
nuclear accidents are not the worst things in the world.
Yeah.
Even 3 Mile Island,
right. That would be
compared to oil. Some of the
yeah.
oil coal plants can do a lot more damage.
Yeah, that's my opinion. In fact, that we are not at a stage of technology where things like wind and solar can replace what we're doing with petrochemicals, but that nuclear is in fact better than oil, or especially better than coal. Coal is the devil, but it's better than oil, and because of fracking, it's better than natural gas. But unfortunately, I also think that the heads of government and industry have done such a terrible job every time there's an accident that we don't trust them anymore. And that's why I think it's fading away unless there's a technological breakthrough.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
In your research, was there a eureka moment where one of these scientists recognized the immense power they were dealing with?
Oh, yes, it happens again and again and again and again. Probably my favorite one is a guy who's another one of these Hungarians. His name is Leo Szilard, and he shares the patent for the first nuclear reactor with Fermi. And when the reactor fires up, he turns to Fermi and says, "This is a black day in human history." And he becomes a fairly he also is the guy who talks Einstein into writing the letter to FDR that starts the entire atomic Manhattan Project. And at the end of his life, he wrote a collection of short stories, and one of which is about how if you were on the losing team in a nuclear war, as a scientist, you might be tried for being a war criminal. And that short story collection ended up being translated into Russian and got into the hands of Sakharov, who became a dissident because he realized that he might be prosecuted as a war criminal. So almost from the minute he first works on this, Szilard is already an arms control enthusiast.
And were these ideas spread through conferences, seminars,
Yes.
and so forth and so
Yes.
on?
Yeah.
And
One of another amazing moment is that Szilard and one of his cohorts show up at the end of World War II because they're going to turn over all of the atomic program to the Pentagon. And he wants it in civilian hands. And Truman and Leslie Groves want it in Pentagon hands. And he's able to actually get the law passed to have the Atomic Energy Commission established so that civilian hands retain those controls.
in your own personal opinion, do you think Truman was trying to scare Stalin, and that's one reason he agreed to it?
Yeah, yeah. We have the three instances I cite in the book are the fact that Truman sidles up to Stalin and says at Potsdam and starts making all these sort of Texan with a gun in his pocket comments about the bomb, and Stalin says, "I hope it works out for you." And what the joke is that Stalin knew about the bomb before Truman, because Truman didn't have the security clearance until he was president to know about it, and Stalin had the greatest spy network in history operating in the United States. So that didn't go off well. But we also have three other instances of people directly saying we dropped the bomb because of Stalin, including one of them being Leslie Groves, and the other being Jimmy Burns, who becomes Secretary of State under Truman. You bet. Yes, ma'am.
Perhaps you already answered this. You were a few minutes late, having found one of the three parking spots in
Could you just use the mic? So
We're videotaping it.
Perhaps you already
I'm
answered
sorry.
this, but if you would just do it again very quickly, I'd appreciate it. Why such interest in this topic that you would commit? And I have to say, he's a dear friend of mine, but he never told me this. You would commit to all the research and all the time, and all the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into creating a book like this?
Well, I really like the fundamental idea of radioactivity, that you have this thing that's sort of half alive but not really alive, and we say that it has a half-life, and all this kind of stuff, and people find that so disturbing, and I find it fascinating. So there's that. There's the fact that, you know, we have this whole picture of what Marie Curie is like, or we don't know anything about her, or we don't know anything about Enrico Fermi, or we have a picture of what outside is like. And finding out what all these people are really like is so amazing. It's just fantastic. And then there's the fact that Rocket Man was about the intersection of government, science, the Pentagon, big business, and it's sort of like this turning point in America where science-wise we were a little bit doddering when that started. In this case, America was a place that had engineered telephones and light bulbs, you know, and then when all of these guys arrived escaping Hitler, it turned into a place that split atoms. So it totally changed American history. So to have all
and
this,
it changes it for people who learn the things that we're learning today, because these are not just names in a textbook.
right? Exactly.
that's great.
Exactly.
Thank you.
So human drama, science mysteries. What's not to like? Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
You've sort of danced around this issue concerning the use of the atomic, very, very nice, to end the Second World War. And I've read elsewhere that another pressure on President Truman and the other people in the Pentagon was that they had spent so much money on this program, if they ended up not using it, that they would have been politically vulnerable.
Yes, absolutely. That is true. Absolutely, I agree.
Turning to the bomb again, if the main motivation was to show Stalin, why was it done twice? And
Because they had to.
My objection actually to the atomic bomb was the second one. I thought they didn't wait long enough for Japan to respond, and I heard one argument was, the city was so devastated it was tough to get news to Tokyo about what actually happened.
Yeah, it was because they only had 2 bombs, so they wanted to drop both of them, essentially. And they did it 3 days apart because they wanted to really put the screws on Japan. The entire American-Japanese war was unbelievably vicious on both sides, and this was sort of the last act that, so this was thank you for Pearl Harbor. Nagasaki was thank you for Pearl Harbor.
I think in fairness, you might want to look at the planning for Operations Coronet and Olympic to invade Japan, and the profundity of effort that was going to go into it. No one was sure in those same papers of the Pentagon that the thing was going to work or the Japanese were going to surrender.
Right.
And there was a coup going on at the same time in Japan to go on with the war, even though the bombs had been dropped. One of the bombs had been dropped during the coup.
Yeah.
So there were many unknowns. I think it'd be fair to say it was a benefit, a political benefit, to understand that, yes, it might be good to demonstrate this for future enemies to understand the power the United States had at the time.
Right. No, that almost everything you're bringing up is actually in the book. I'm just doing the spiffy version here. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What is the history of too cheap to meter? So at some point we thought that it would be too cheap to meter, and then obviously then it didn't turn out that way.
Right. Eisenhower wanted one of his legacies to be not atomic bombs, but atomic power. So he created a program called Atoms for Peace. And during that period, the head of the AEC did a speaking tour where he said, in the future, electricity produced by nuclear power is going to be so cheap, it'll be too cheap to meter. It'll be essentially free. And a number of fantastic things came out of that program, including Edward Teller, who comes up with the backyard bomb, who gets Reagan to start Star Wars. He comes up with the idea of, if you don't like where your mountain is, call us. We'll move it for you. He was going to use atomic weapons to redig the Panama Canal, and they wanted to use it for fracking. So it was quite a program. But the one good thing is that they created this nuclear-powered ship, the Savannah, and on that Savannah was a nuclear oven called the radar range, which we have today as the microwave. Yes.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for your presentation. As
Thank
someone
you.
who's never been able to stay focused on her science classes, this was really I learned a lot, and it was very entertaining.
Thank you.
I work for an association that represents radiation oncologists, and I was just wondering if your book addresses some of the benefits of, sort of medical issues, or some of the
Yes.
benefits of radiation in terms of oncology or even diagnostic radiology or things like that, and kind of the balance between what we've gotten that's good versus.
It has your entire history in it. It has the guy who invented radiation oncology in Chicago, and it has the fact that the people used to judge the strength of their x-rays by putting their hand in the beam and getting a little bit of a sunburn, which led to many of them dying of leukemia. But the whole end of the book is we have to weigh the benefits of this. One of the sad things is that, the reputations of people like I think that people don't know what Marie Curie did because what she did was radiation, and they don't want to taint her reputation with radiation. So the end of the book is, a lot of wonderful things have come out of this science, not only carbon-14, which everyone knows about, but nuclear medicine. And I do go on to how nuclear medicine is as important as the microscope. Yes. Okay. Oh.
Well, you were mentioning tests in Nevada. What period were those tests going on in?
The 50s.
Like mid-50s?
It's from Eisenhower to Kennedy. So Kennedy stopped. So the open air testing is stopped during after Bay of Pigs. So that's 64, and then I think it's 51 to 64. But I'm not.
So
Can someone look that up for him on the phone? Does anyone here have a phone? Anyway,
So we're all irradiated.
yes, everyone here is irradiated, well irradiated, but we were irradiated already because of all the natural radiation in the atmosphere. But no, we're all irradiated by Nevada too. Well, thank you so much. This has been a great pleasure. I really appreciate it.